In the last lecture, we finished with the Mexican nationalization of oil, which was led by the Communist Party and was done in 1938. We talked a little bit about the first few years of Pemex as a state oil company, and then we cut that off because obviously communism has not yet come to Mexico. So what happens in the next half century will be discussed in subsequent lectures there. But what we want to do now is to see how Borodin's trip to the New World kicked off communist parties everywhere else in Latin America. Well, the next one that was kicked off was done by him again personally. I think I mentioned he stopped in Havana Harbor, and he was only there for about 6 hours, but he was long enough to meet with some communists, would-be communists there, who were of the same type that had met him at the border in Tamaulipas and brought him to Mexico City. One of them that met him on that ship was named Marcelo Salinas, and Borodin gave his report to the Comintern on January 21st, 1920, a little over a full year later. And in that report he describes his meeting with this Cuban and the decision he had taken then and there to organize the Cuban Party under the leadership of this Cuban, Marcelo Salinas, as General Secretary. Salinas said, Borodin said that Salinas was the soul of the newspaper, El Hombre Nuevo, New Man, that had its focus on the Cuban working class. Salinas, Borodin said, was the leader of the Trade Union Federation in Cuba. This document, along with Salinas' application letter to the Comintern, is in collection 495 of the Executive Committee of the Comintern as it's archived in Moscow today. Salinas had Borodin's imprimatur as the new Cuban communist leader, so recognition by the Comintern for the Cuban Party came very quickly. On August 1920, the Cuban Communists had formed a Central Committee, and 5 years later, that party, that is in August of 25, exactly 5 years later, the party announced its emergence on the Cuban electoral stage, and it formally launched itself into Cuban politics under the leadership of a student activist named Julio Antonio Mella, former Jose Marti Lieutenant Carlos Balino, and a Polish Jewish immigrant named Fabio Grobart. That was the seedling. The tree that grew from it was the Cuban Trade Union Federation, which had been fertile ground from day one, as the party founder Marcelo Salinas had been its leading light. By the end of 1929, the Communist Party of Cuba, PCC, was its most important driver. In 1933, the Communist Party overthrew the Cuban dictator Gerardo Moncada. Armed and armored by the Cuban working class, intelligentsia, and trade union federation, and encouraged by the Mexican communists and their de facto alliance with the progressive bourgeois government of Plutarco Calles, the Cubans decided to fight for the overthrow of the dictator General Gerardo Mikado. Actually, they had little choice, as Mikado had already made them his number one enemy. Mikado had started as one of Jose Marti's three youngest generals. Marti is the man that had been defeating the Spanish at the time the U.S. intervened in the Spanish-Cuban War, and Mikado had been a leader of the right wing of the broad alliance that Marti had put together. He had impressed his backers by being the general that had been used to suppress the rebel black community in different parts of Oriente and in Havana. And so the gringo government, which was now taking over Cuba, had decided that they were going to back him, this guy Mikado, as their key man, as he promised to destroy the communists in Cuba. Mikado had staged a series of bombings of movie theaters and civil venues and blamed these bombings on the communists. And using this as an excuse, he declared martial law in Cuba and began the wholesale arrest and murder of trade unionists and communists. Fleeing the island temporarily was one of the party's founders, this Julio Mella, who took refuge with Mexican communists in Mexico City. But there, Mikado assassins caught up with him and shot him dead on January 10, 1929, while he was walking at night with his wife. His wife survived, and she led the campaign for getting justice for her husband and by getting Mikado out of office. Mia was one of the early subjects for the Mexican painter Diego Rivera's paintings, which is called The Cuban. But at any rate, the Cuban Communist Party had decided to fight for power, and as I say, they really didn't have a lot of choice. The armed struggle against them had begun in 1931, and by the end of 1932, Mikado's regime was in serious trouble as it lost more and more control over the island. On July 27th of 1933, Havana bus drivers went on strike for their own demands, and 2 days later, intercity drivers struck in solidarity. Soldiers fired on demonstrators in Havana on August 1st, killing 2 of them, and on the same day in Santa Clara, shops and theaters were closed. Police attacked a group of striking teachers. War transportation workers went on strike. In Pinar del Rio, which is on the other end of the island from Oriente, the extreme western part of the island, drivers, tobacco workers, and journalists also went on strike, and in the meantime the Sugar Workers Union organized demonstrations and hunger marches throughout the country. In the following days, more groups joined the campaign. In Havana, many storekeepers closed and garages refused to sell gas. Typographers and journalists struck, and the longshoremen and their dockers walked out. The Cuban Communist Party organized and supported all of these demands, and there were reports of many strikes in the interior of the country. Finally, a general strike was called for August 5th of 1933. So, what had started out as a bus driver strike in July, by August had turned out into a general strike of the labor movement across the country. Now, during that strike, the army divided. The NCOs, the non-commissioned officers, defected against Mikado and his officers and to the side of the workers and the students. Despite U.S. attempts to save Mikado by sending Sumner Welles there, who came with new orders from Washington in April of 1933, it was too late. By the end of August 1933, Welles threw in the towel and acquiesced to Sergeant Batista. Sergeant Fulgencio Batista led the army, and he staged the sergeant's coup in support of the strikers on September 4th, 1933. This put the NCOs in alliance with the Communist Party. Mikado was out. He fled to Miami, where he eventually died of natural causes in 1939. From 1933 to 1940, Batista ran the government through a 5-man with strong support from the communists and the liberal bourgeoisie. Initially, Batista allowed the liberal bourgeoisie to make Ramon Grau San Martin a provisional president, but replaced him on January 14, 1934. 5 days later, the U.S. recognized the Cuban government of Batista's stooge Carlos Mendieta. Now, during these years, former Sergeant Fulgencio Batista ran the country behind the scenes, having promoted himself to colonel, using puppet presidents, beginning with Ramon Grau San Martin in 1933, Carlos Mendieta 1934-1935, Jose Barnet 1935-1936, Miguel Gomez in 1936, and finally Federico Bru from 1936 to 1940. But all this time it was Batista who always directed the government, but now was able to turn more of his time to making money. And his big buddy and his gangster friend in those years was Meyer Lansky, who replaced the official U.S. bosses, such as Sumner Welles, as the most important leader determining U.S. influence in Cuba's domestic affairs. Meyer Lansky, as you recall, was head of the American Crime Commission, North American Crime Commission, and the biggest gangster and most successful money man the Mafia ever had in the United States. Initially, Lansky had been loading molasses from Cuba onto ships, and he would take those ships to Florida and then truck it into Canada for the use of manufacturing liquor. You see some of this discussed in the movie Godfather 2. The Cuban enterprise expanded with the passage of time until only the eventual success of Ben Siegel's adventure in Las Vegas surpassed it. And you'll see that business and how it relates to Cuba in the movie Bugsy. Now, the Diaz-Balart gang is now the important factor in terms of domestic comprador capitalists. The Lansky cartel had taken on native partners, including the family of Rafael Julio Diaz-Balart, who was a Cuban lawyer for the United Fruit Company, which is now called Chiquita, and a typical reactionary Cuban comprador. He had 2 children, Rafael and Mirta. His son, Rafael Lincoln Diaz-Balart, was Batista's secret police chief after the coup of 1952. His daughter, Mirta Diaz-Balart, married Fidel Castro in 1948. Foreseeing the inevitable success of Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution against Batista, Rafael Julio Diaz-Balart and the entire family stole the remaining millions they could get their hands off from the Cuban treasury, and they fled the island. 1 month later, Che Guevara seized Santa Clara, Fidel Castro seized Santiago, New Year's Eve 58, New Year's Day 59, respectively. The Diaz-Balart gang would never get back to Cuba. Instead, they established a new beachhead for their criminal activities in Miami, Florida, where they rule local politics to this day. Needless to say, corruption deepened under the Diaz-Balart gang and their stooge Fulgencio Batista. The pattern had been set in the decades of the 1930s as United Fruit Lawyer, and their Rafael Julio Diaz-Balart stole everything that he could get his hands on, along with United Fruit. Along the way, Meyer Lansky gunned his way via Lucky Luciano inside the Diaz-Balart Batista syndicate, even as Lansky had simultaneously sent Ben Siegel to do with Mickey Cohen and Jack Dragna in Hollywood. The same thing is shown in the film Bugsy. In these days, the Diaz-Balarts and Batista cronies became the only real factor in obtaining government employment and in getting government contracts and permits. However, during the early years of this time, workers also made many gains, as did student organizations. Persecution of the communists was halted, and in the period of 1933 to 1948, the communists had de facto legal status, including becoming the first communist party in this hemisphere to have government ministers. In the Batista government of 1940, which had been elected in 1939, the communists gained the legal status that they had wanted for so long and emerged as strong in Cuba as the Mexican communists had become with President Cardenas. This alliance was perfected when Batista won the 1940 elections and two top Communist Party leaders, Juan Marinello and Carlos Rafael Rodriguez, entered the new Batista government as cabinet members. Batista's honest electoral victory was followed by an equally honest Batista defeat 4 years later, as the presidential election went to the first post-Mikado provisional president, Ramon Grau de San Martin. Meyer Lansky counseled Batista to accept the election results and enjoy his large fortune while waiting to see how things developed. Lansky thought, Batista might be needed again, and Batista did not seem to mind. He took some $20 million and he retired in Daytona Beach, Florida. Carlos Roca, who was the Communist Party's first secretary, and Carlos Rafael Rodriguez, the Communist Party's second secretary, felt the same way about possibly needing Batista again, and they said in a book they published jointly in 1946 that they authored and published called In Defense of the People, they said, quote, "The great man of national politics, parentheses, Batista, end of parentheses, the people's idol," unquote, was only in temporary absence. So, not all progressives in Cuba, however, saw the same way about Batista. One that stands out today was a young Belen High School student. Belen High School in Havana was kind of like Phillips Academy is in Andover, Massachusetts today, named Fidel Castro Ruz. In 1944, Castro attacked Juan Marinello's educational policy, discriminating against private education, and in turn, the communist daily newspaper, Hoy, which means today, attacked him. By this time, the Juan Marinello was head of the Cuban Communist Party, and was an elected communist senator from Havana as of the 1944 elections that had unseated Batista. October 5th, at the University of Havana Law School. Grau San Martin was the new Cuban president. However, much as Lansky had expected and financially arranged, Grau San Martin moved quickly right, and in so doing, and became an outright flunky of the Lansky cartel in Cuba. In so doing, San Martin had earned the wrath of Cuba's non-Batista elite, including the Orthodox Party chief Eduardo Chibas. Chibas came from the old Cuban aristocracy in Castro's province of Oriente, where Fidel's father himself was wealthy, but of the overseer class. Belen High School, like Andover's Film Academy, had accepted not only the sons of the truly rich, but also of their sycophant class of retainers. This would be a good time for you to review for those of you who haven't seen the movie Fidel, the Showtime movie production, to get a cinematic view of these early Fidel Castro days, because they've done an excellent job of showing Fidel Castro's relationship with Mirta Diaz-Balart, who he married and has a philosophy major at the University of Havana. And she was, of course, the only son of the boss himself, the only daughter of the boss himself, Rafael Julio Diaz-Balart. At any rate, Eduardo Chivas was an honest Cuban politician from the Orthodox Party who opposed the Batista dictatorship imposed on his country by U.S. imperialism and its host of willing sycophants, like Rafael Julio Diaz-Balart. Chivas was leading a crusade to save Cuba that Fidel Castro joined. However, Chivas felt he'd been tricked into promising something that he could not now fulfill. And he had promised the Cuban people on a radio show that on the following Sunday, when he gave his next radio show, he would have all of the data to prove how the Batista gang had been stealing all of this money from the government. Well, his sources of information were not any good, and he wasn't able to do what he wanted to do. He knew he'd been tricked, and he knew that he had to do something. What he did was a shock to the nation. While he was on the radio on August 16th, 1951, he shot himself in the head. He died a few days later. Now, this infuriated Fidel Castro because he realized that Chivas had done what he did because of the way he'd been tricked by the Batista group, and this made Fidel decide to follow a different path. 7 months after the Chivas dramatic suicide, Fulgencio Batista returned to Cuba as its new president, staging a military takeover of the island and the government coup d'etat. He had running in a four-way speech, had also put their candidate run first, which was the man that had just shot himself. Fidel Castro himself was running for Congress on the Orthodox Party ticket. Behind Batista was Meyer Lansky and, of course, the U.S. crime cartel and all of their flunkies at the U.S. Embassy. Again, you can take a look at Godfather 2 to see how these guys were actually working. Fidel's brother-in-law, Mirta's brother, Rafael Lincoln Diaz-Balart, was the chief of police of the secret police under Batista. So this whole inter-family thing is playing out at the same time as the Cuban Revolution is playing out. As I mentioned before, Diaz-Balart Sr., he took off. He could see the handwriting on the wall, and a month before the final battle of the Cuban Civil War, he headed for Miami. They spatted a whole new group of criminals with the name Diaz-Balart that they're still proud of in Miami, and was eventually joined by another fascist down there named Ileana Rose-Lehtinen, who's a congresswoman from one of the Diaz-Balart U.S. House districts in Florida. At any rate, back in Cuba in 1952, Fidel Castro had enough of bourgeois politics, and he decided to organize a plot to overthrow the usurper, Fulgencio Batista. And he put together an organization a revolutionary organization in Havana, secretly, and he managed to get 135 young men and women under his leadership and that of his brother, Raul Castro Ruz, to attack the Moncada Barracks in Santiago, Cuba on the 26th of July, 1953. Another 24 fighters were scheduled to attack the barracks at Guayamo, also in Oriente Province, at the same time. The attack failed by the skin of its teeth, and the dictator murdered all but a handful of the captured survivors, torturing their captured leaders. Fidel and Raul escaped for a few days, taking refuge in the nearby mountains of the Sierra Maestras, and eventually they were captured and put on trial. Fidel's speech to the judges assembled in his hospital room was subsequently secretly published throughout the nation, entitled "History Will Absolve Me." And the survivors were sentenced to 15 years in prison. The best movie available about all of this is the Showtime movie Fidel in English that's generally available. Carlos Prieto, who I was about to meet, made another movie for Fidel, Raul, Che Guevara in Cuba, but it was with a Mexican film production company, and Washington put so much pressure on them the Mexican government refused to allow it to be shown in Mexico except in a few special showings to private audiences, which is where I saw it for the first time. Meanwhile, in Guatemala, we have Jacobo Arbenz, who was a Guatemalan army officer who had served as its Minister of Defense from 1944 until 1951. In 1950, Arbenz was elected as President of the Republic in Guatemala's first democratic election. You'll recall that we have already gone through that period after 1945 where Truman reversed FDR's foreign policy and now began to institute anti-progressive, anti-communist dictatorships in their own image, in their own fascist image, wherever they could, which included Guatemala. Arbenz took office in March 1951, and he began a program. This guy was never anything more than what I would call a mild-mannered reformer. But what he wanted to do was to have a little bit of social justice for the mass of Guatemalan farmers. But for this, he earned the hatred of the United Fruit Company, which is now called Chiquita, and which was the exploiter of all of these poor farmers. And they had, of course, to help them out, the U.S. CIA, which had been created precisely to be the shock troops to enforce the imposition of gringo fascism all over Latin America. The U.S. was organizing, therefore, a military coup to topple Arbenz through the CIA, and they carried it out. They had had recent success in Iran, you may recall, a few months earlier by overthrowing the legitimate government there. The CIA plot against Guatemala began in February of '54, and in May, the CIA invasion from Honduras began under their puppet Colonel Castillo Armas. The real boss of was the United Fruit chief lawyer and now U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. Like the Iranian adventure, the Guatemalan operation would come to haunt Gringolandia for many decades. But in the case of the overthrow of Guatemala's government, the payback would begin almost immediately. Enter Che Guevara. Ernesto Che Guevara first heard of Fidel Castro's patriotic adventure against the Batista Santiago garrison, called the Moncada Barracks, while he was either in Panama or Costa Rica on his first trip north. If you've read his book or seen or if you've read the book or seen the movie Motorcycle Diaries, then you'll know the trip that we're talking about. He had been accompanied by his friend, another Argentine physician named Alberto Granada, who then from there went back to Argentina, but Che had gone as far north as Panama alone. Che took a ship to Miami from there and then went to another boat that took him back to Buenos Aires. In Panama, Che had realized that what Arbenz needed in Guatemala were doctors willing to work among the poor, so he had decided to go back to Buenos Aires and finish his medical degree. He did so in June of '53, and 1 month later he was back on the trail of social revolution to unite all the Americas, and in July of '53 he began his return to Latin America, again going through some of the countries that he had already visited and those that he had not. He had been in Chile, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, and Panama, but now he was concentrating on Bolivia, Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador. He arrived in Guatemala on Christmas Eve of 1953 on this second trip. Here he met his first wife, a Peruvian aprista, that is, a Peruvian woman with the party called APRA, that we've talked about before in this alliance, which is not a communist party. In fact, it would soon become an enemy of the Communist Party, but at any rate, he met Hilda there. She had been a aprista, and she was in Guatemala hoping to help with the support of Arbenz. Arbenz wrote a book about this whole episode called The Shark and the Sardines. Well, it was in Mexico City where Che fled next after the overthrow of Arbenz that he first meets Fidel Castro. Now, the first man he met there that introduced him to Fidel was Nico Lopez. Nico told him about Fidel Castro and that a campaign was being organized to free Fidel and his brother Raul and the other Moncada survivors from the Cuban prison on the Isle of Pines. So he told him, you're going to have to wait a while for those guys to get here. Well, so he had several months to wait for the Castro brothers when he and Hilda arrived in Mexico City. When Fidel did arrive, Che was ready and on board with the waiting Fidelista veterans from the Moncada contingent, and Fidel agreed to take him, and he became the medic for the Revolutionary Army that he was preparing. Well, what was the task of this army? To invade Cuba and pick up where Moncada had left off. In other words, to start the Civil War again against Batista. Waiting for Fidel in Mexico City, Dr. Guevara went to work immediately lecturing at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, called UNAM, UNAM, medical school, and practicing medicine at Mexico City's General Hospital in its allergy department. Allergies were something he was particularly interested in because of his asthma. But at any rate, the Castro brothers were released from their Cuban prison along with their compatriots on May 15, 1955, and Raul fled to Mexico immediately, along with most of the others. Fidel went to the USA to raise money from the emigre Cuban community in Florida and New York. Nico introduced Dr. Che Guevara to Raul Castro as soon as Raul arrived in Mexico City at the end of May 55, by which time he had been waiting some 9 months, practicing medicine and teaching at Latin America's leading university. Fidel rented a ranch outside on the outskirts of Mexico City and began training some 136 men, utilizing the services of former Spanish Civil War Republican Colonel Alberto Bayo. Bayo had been living in Mexico City as one of the millions of Republicans who had fled Spain with the French defeat of the Republic. Many of these anti-fascist Republicans, with the Franco defeat of the Republic, many of these anti-fascist Republicans had found refuge in Mexico. Bayo had obtained some fame as a guerrilla warfare expert, meaning going behind Franco's lines and dynamiting trains and other infrastructural facilities. And we talked about some of this in Chapter 16. Che Guevara joined this training group, this boot camp, as a medic, but he soon found that command was the more logical choice of occupations for him than medicine. Fidel had bought a yacht called Grandma and had refurbished it sufficiently, he thought, to cross with his men from Mexico to Cuba. And he managed to get 82 of those guys on board the Grandma in the Veracruz port of Tuxpan. And somehow they got out of that shore, and they got about halfway to their trip to Oriente province when they got hit by a tropical storm or hurricane and almost didn't make it. They eventually did land on December 2nd, 1956 at the Playa Los Colorados near the town of Niquero. Niquero was then in province of Oriente. Now it's in a new separate province named Granma after the landing ship. But at any rate, the landing beach greeting party had been arranged by Celia Sanchez to lead them into the interior. But she had gone home when the Fidelistas failed to show up as scheduled, and so the Granma had been lost for days at sea in some kind of storm. Celia was destined to become Fidel Castro's second wife and Cuba's first lady. Just a quick aside on that. While Fidel was in prison, he either mislabeled letters that he was sending to his wife and to another woman in Cuba who was his mistress, or else the police switched the letters into the different envelopes. But what had happened is that Mirta Diaz-Balart, his wife, had gotten the letter that he had sent to his mistress and vice versa. For this, Mirta had decided to divorce him, and she took their son and went to Miami. That was the end of his first marriage. So he's now available to be married again, and the woman he's going to marry is Celia Sanchez. They got ambushed at a place called Alegre de Pio. That's a cane field. 82 of them got ashore. About 20 got away, and 11 of those finally made it up into the mountains, and that's where they all got together again, and Fidel had said the days of the dictatorship are numbered. When I arrived in Mexico City on September 1st, 1962, Carlos Prieto told me that when Fidel came across the building remnants of his army, he had said, now the days of the dictatorship are numbered, and many of the people thought they'd lost it, he'd lost his mind because they had nothing except his confidence. Well, I think I've already mentioned to you that the Cuban Revolution had already changed my life in the sense that I had tried to join Fidel in 1968 when I just turned 16 years old and had been picked up by the FBI at a roadblock outside of Wichita before I could get to Key West and then across to Havana. But that's all recounted in a book I wrote as the first volume of my autobiography. That autobiography is now available in some libraries. You can find the libraries at a place called worldcat.org. It's called Idaho Smith's Search for the Foundation, the first volume of which deals with these matters, called The Buccaneer. You can also get it in Kindle books at Amazon.com. That's the ebook publisher. That's probably the easiest way to get it. And there are some used copies I've noticed available on the used book market. Now the FBI, well, skip over all that. By the time I got to Havana now in '62, got to Mexico City, I was talking with a man who had been just going back and forth ever since 1959, interviewing the Cuban leaders. Now, first he went back and forth because he was also a leader of the Mexican Communist Party, and they wanted to be sure that this Fidel Castro wasn't just another typical labor faker, Latin American left-wing leader who would say anything to get elected, an Obama kind of guy, and then once he takes power, he does exactly the opposite. So Carlos had gone over there in '59 and he'd met with Fidel and Raúl and Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos, and other great leaders of the Cuban Revolution, and he was convinced that this was the real thing. He came back there and he told this to the Mexican Party leaders, and they thought, well, Carlos Prieto is a really emotional kind of guy, and he is caught up in all of this romance of this Cuban thing. We need to send somebody else there. And David Alfaro Siqueiros was apparently out of prison long enough that he was able to make a follow-up trip there, and he came back, and he was what they considered to be a much more sober intellectual, and he said, Carlos Prieto is right. These guys are the real thing. These are real people that are going to take Cuba down the road to communism. Well, by the time I got there, on September 1st, 1962, got to Mexico City, Carlos had been going back and forth all through '59, '60, and '61, and the earlier part of this year, '62, he was on the telephone all the time to Havana, talking with these guys. I was there listening to him tell us stories about what he had learned when he was there, and I was listening to his phone calls because he wanted me to, and I felt I had a real front row seat in terms of what was coming up, which was what was being planned now was the U.S. invasion of Cuba with its own armed forces. They had 100,000 men standing by on U.S. naval ships, 100,000 Marines. They're not going to use any flunky Cuban mercenaries that you can't rely on to fight once you get them on shore. And they were going to do the job themselves. We go back to our story now at Alegre de Pio and the flight of Castro and his men into the foothills. What they were confronting then wasn't just the average Latin American military thugs, fascist police who they used to suppress workers and students, but you're talking about the biggest army in Latin America that was heavily armed by the United States. And whenever Batista got in trouble in the future, if he was having trouble getting arms from the U.S. directly, he could always get them from Lansky. So that's what Fidel was up against when 11 of his fighters met on December 21st in the Sierra Maestra Mountains in Cuba. Now, Fidel Castro wrote a book called Reminiscences of the Cuban Revolutionary War, and you can read that on the internet. I think the entire thing is published and there is available gratis. I know there's an Ocean Press edition of this book that was held by the copyright of Che Guevara's second wife, Aleda March, and an introduction by his daughter, Aleda Guevara, M.D. It is the basis for the movie Che Part 1, so you might want to look at that book and those movies again to get a deeper insight into all of this, as well as this particular chapter 31 of the ABCs of Communism 2015 edition. La Plata River Barracks battle was the turning point that I mentioned briefly before, and this occurred when Fidel and his men attacked on January 17th, 1957. Now remember, this is only a few weeks after they've landed in '56. So He's got his 11 men, plus a few more that they've recruited from the local farming class, poor farmers. They've gotten together enough guns and bullets to make an assault on this stockade, which is at the mouth of the La Plata River as it goes into the ocean. Guevara later wrote, "La Plata was our first victory. It was clear to everybody that a rebel army existed and was ready for battle. To us, it was the confirmation of the chances to the final victory." Now, I went over quickly about Herbert Matthews' visit to Cuba, which occurred shortly after that in February '57, because less than 2 months later, it was when after the landing, Herbert Matthews had made his way to the Oriente province, with Celia Sanchez leading him back there as supposedly as a mining company investor. So all of this was being reported, and I was reading about it in the Idaho newspapers, and of course it was getting a certain amount of press on AP, UPI, and so on. And I won't go over all of that again to say, but you'll recall that Matthews was really looking at about 22 men that were going back and forth, changing their clothes and hats and stuff enough to make them look different, hoping that to Matthews all Cubans would look the same, and they did pretty much, because they fooled him. He thought he was looking at several hundred or several thousand men, and so when he told his story on the New York Times, it was only a couple of months after this initial invasion. What Batista had tried to tell the country, that Fidel Castro had been wiped out, that they were all dead and so on, now the country knew that Batista was lying through his teeth. So everything began to change, and of course people began to flock into Oriente one way or another. You could block the roads, but after all, to get around a roadblock, all you do is have to walk off the road a certain distance and walk around it. So if you're really dedicated and you want to get back there, you could. So all of a sudden, Fidel actually has more fighters than he's got guns for, and the next big thing they have to do is to get more guns. Well, the fascist press in the U.S. was pretty upset about this trick that had been played on Batista, and so magazines like National Review began to run full-page ads that said, "I got my job through the New York Times," and it was show Fidel Castro smoking a cigar. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, but after the defeat of the garrison at La Plata, Batista had tried to reinforce his position in Oriente, and the rebels answered on May 28, '57, when Fidel's forces attacked Batista's sizable rural guard and army outpost on the Oriente coast at Uyero. A great visual presentation of this first battle is made in that movie Che Part 1, and also in Showtime's Fidel. And it was essentially the exact same strategy they'd used at La Plata, except that this time they had a much more significant target. This time the rebels were relatively well armed, and on the night of May 18th, weapons had arrived from a local landowner ingratiating himself with the rebels. Guevara says they now had 3 tripod machine guns, 3 Madsen machine guns, 9 M1 carbines with 45 rounds apiece, 10 Johnson automatic rifles, and some 6,000 rounds. Shea says that from this time forward, he ceased being just the medic for the column, which now consisted of 3 platoons, and became a fighter in charge of one of the tripod machine guns. Fidel had a large force by this time. After discharging a number of men, he had 127 total under arms, and about 80 of them were heavily armed. Camilo Cienfuegos commanded 1 platoon, Almeida another platoon, and Jorge Sotus the 3rd platoon. The Fidelistas set up their attack so as to hit the army barracks at Uvero from 3 sides, of the 4th side being the sea. The main barracks building had strong forward strong points with 3 to 4 soldiers each, but each of these strong points also contained civilians. So the rebel force didn't want to kill them too, so they wanted to sneak as close as possible to the main barracks building beyond the strong points before the shooting got started. Once they got into position, they did what Che Guevara says is the key thing that a revolutionary fighter does, and that is his only reason for being there is because he's put his entire life at the disposal of this movement. So he will do whatever is necessary, including running forward under fire, throwing firing possible targets, because that's what he came to do, and that's what he wants to do more than anything else. So the spiritual superiority of the 26th of July fighters, which by now is the name of Fidel's movement, which will become a party, 26 de Julio, proves itself. Its spiritual superiority is clearly proven. Now, Fidel lost 6 dead, 9 wounded, but the enemy suffered 14 dead, 19 wounded, and they had surrendered, giving him 133 men. He doesn't want to take care of prisoners of war because he's not set up for that, so they give them some lectures and hand them some medicine to take care of their wounded and cut them loose. Those 133 men are just too many for the Batista government to suppress, to keep their mouths shut. They spread here and there and everywhere and tell this story that Matthews has already made public knowledge. And so more and more information is flowing back to Havana and Santiago from these Oriente fighters. The guerrillas and the farmers gradually became one, is the way that Che Guevara expresses this in his book. Now, they established a school and some study circles, and from that time forward, one of the first tasks assigned to new recruits was to become literate. Che was given the responsibility for this school, which also functioned to give Che an opportunity to give his advanced comprehension of world politics to these people as they were learning how to read and write. In other words, he was teaching them Marxism as the Dick and Jane of their reading classes. So he would soon have an army that had fighters, cadre, and officers sophisticated in Marxist theory and practice, even if they were at a first, second, third grade reading level. This first rebel school was set up in Las Minas del Frio, and the second school was set up at a place called La Mesa. On July 21st, 1957, Fidel nominated Che as a comandante and gave him command of the Army's second column. About this, Che writes, quote, "In a very informal way, I was nominated commander of the second column of the guerrilla army. The dose of vanity that anyone has inside of him made me the proudest man in the world that day," unquote. So he is completely on board with the armed struggle strategy that the Fidelistas are following. The Orthodox Party joins with Fidel in the Sierra on 12th of July of 1957. Now you see, they've only been there for what, a full 7 months by this time. Fidel met with the leaders of the Orthodox Party of the Sierra at this time, and the two parties agreed to form an alliance. Remember, at this time, to the Orthodox Party leadership, Fidel and his brother and the rest of them are pretty much like themselves. They don't even know that Raul Castro had been in the Communist Party for a long time. But they do know from talking to Fidel that they know he's one of their old guys that had come to the defense of Chivas after he was assassinated and fought for the overthrow of Batista and the attack on Moncada Barracks. So they have good feelings about him. So this alliance is cemented. So now the 26th of July movement has effectively co-opted the entire Orthodox Party structure, which is national throughout Cuba, into its organization. This mass base of resistance began with them, and as time went on, it would grow to include just about everybody, and not only the working class and farming classes, but of the bourgeoisie in Oriente province, and also in Santiago. So, in Santiago, the attack on Santiago had made Fidel into a household name in that city, and then everybody had lived through the campaign to free him and the others from the Isle of Pines. The way Fidel saw it was he thought of Moncada Barracks the way John Brown thought about the attack at Harper's Ferry. It was to be the opening shot of a civil war. Well, John Brown's was the opening shot of the U.S. Civil War. John Brown's body lies smoldering in the grave, the battle hymn of the Republic about John Brown, so on. All of these things which became the core of the ideology of the Union Army during the Civil War in the United States. Similar thing had happened in Cuba. So Moncada had served that function, or as far as Castro was concerned, it had been successful. Now, other people might say, well, everybody but a few of you got killed there, so I don't know how successful that was, but you couldn't talk Fidel out of the idea that this had been a success. And I guess in a way it was. So another man enters the picture about this time in Cuba who becomes very important, and this is Frank País. Now, he was born in 1935. His parents had emigrated from Galicia, a northernmost province of Spain, and his father was a Protestant minister and a founder of Santiago's First Baptist Church. He died, however, when Frank was only 5 years old, and his brother Josue was only 2. When Batista staged his coup in 1952, Frank was old enough, that is 17, to know what was going on and to join in the mass protest against the new dictator. He tried unsuccessfully to get the soldiers at Moncada Barracks to give him and others guns so they could fight against the usurper. Frank changed his university major from architecture to get an immediately employable degree to help his mother financially and his 2 younger brothers a tertiary education. So he enrolled in the Oriente Teachers College and graduated on July 6, 1953, 20 days before Fidel attacked the Moncada Barracks on July 26, 53. So you can see they are absolute age contemporaries in this sense. Now, the Fidelistas were fascinated by what Frank and his brothers had done, and Fidel had talked about it in his speech, History Will Absolve Me, that had successfully gotten him off the death list and onto the Isle of Pines for 15 years. That was not easily done. I remember Carlos telling me that Batista had sent doctors to kill Fidel when he was in the hospital, but after they talked to him, they refused to do it. And so Batista had little choice but to accede to the many family requests that were coming from Fidel's mother, his priest, and other people that were important within Cuba, that Fidel at least be put on trial. And their idea of a trial was to bring what passed for the court into Fidel's hospital room, and there he gave his History Will Absolve Me speech, which took me 5 hours to read the first time I read it. He gave that from memory. And to the degree that people could get it written down, they did, and it was published all over Cuba subsequently. Well, by the time Fidel arrived in Mexico in 1955, Frank País had built a vast organization in Oriente and in Santiago and in some other major cities. And so the Fidelistas' plan had been to land at this beach where Celia Sanchez would pick them up. At the very same time, Frank País was supposed to start an armed uprising in Santiago and some other cities. Well, as you see, they got lost at sea, and so they didn't land, and so Celia couldn't on the right day, so they were days late getting there. But Frank País did his part. There was an uprising in Santiago, and the conclusion of that was that gunmen managed to suppress, that is, Batista's gunmen managed to suppress the Frank País organization, and after 4 days. By the time that Fidel arrived, the entire Frank País revolt had been liquidated, and most of those guerrillas who were captured were murdered. Frank País was on the run. On March 8th of 57, the police found Frank, took him into custody, supposedly to bring him to trial. And he was brought to trial in May of 57. Again, however, he went into hiding because he knew that they were not going to give up just because he'd won that legal process. On June 30th that year, 57, Frank's youngest brother, Josue, was murdered by the Batista secret police. Now, this was an act of intimidation, as the youngest brother was virtually uninvolved in this entire matter. So it was their way of getting to Frank. Then on July 26th of 57, the secret police found Frank and his second-in-command, a man named Raul Pujol, and took them to Rampart Lane in Santiago and executed them while they were kneeling, firing a round into the back of each head. So the news of the assassination infuriated Santiago, And on July 30th, 57, workers staged a spontaneous general strike that paralyzed the city, and a new flood of volunteers headed for the Sierra. And this time, Fidel would have guns for everybody. So what had happened was this. In March of 58, 6 months after the País assassination, a secret C-147 flight would arrive from San Jose, Costa Rica. And on it, it was delivering a very heavy shipment of arms from Costa Rica's new president, Jose Figueres. It included 250 machine guns, 250 automatic rifles, 225 mortars and bazookas, well over 1 million rounds of ammunition, and small arms ranging from pistols to hand grenades. Meanwhile, Castro's guerrillas increased their attacks on military outposts, forcing the government to withdraw all of its forces from the Sierra Maestra region. On September 17th, 5 Army trucks fell into the ambush, one Army rebel ambush, for example, and in December 57, the Army tried to counterattack by air, bombing Las Minas and destroying most of it, including that school. But they could not hold the ground, so they soon withdrew. So we've gone all through 1957, but now Fidel's got money and guns, as well as plenty of people that are coming in as a result of the Frank País uprising and the subsequent brutal suppression of it in Santiago. By the spring of 58, the rebels controlled a hospital, schools, a printing press, a slaughterhouse, a landmine factory, a cigar-making factory. They had their own radio station, probably the most important thing. They called it Radio Rebelle. You see a good portrayal of how they used this in that Showtime movie, Fidel. But at any rate, the strategy was to destroy Batista's army, first by expanding from a relatively secure base they now had in Oriente to the north of that province, and simultaneously to strike westward into Matanzas, Camagüey, and Las Villas provinces, and finally all the way to Pinar del Rio province on the opposite side of the island. The rebel army would then close the ring around Havana. That's how the strategy looked in the spring of 58. In February 24th, 58, this Radio Rebelde kicks off. It has its broadcasting tower on the highest point in the Sierra Maestras, Mount Turquina, which is also the General Staff headquarters for the rebel army. Celia Sanchez is the head of this whole thing. And she is the one that's giving most of the radio broadcasts. She has a good radio voice. People like to listen to her. Everybody knows if you want to find out any news, you don't turn on the official government channels because they're just going to lie to you. So you turn in on Radio Rebelde, and Celia Sanchez will give you the news about what's really happening out there. It's kind of like today. If you want to know what's going on in Ukraine, you sure don't want to look at the AP, UP, CBS, ABC, NBC, PBS, NPR pack of lies, because that's all it is, just straightforward pack of lies. You better turn to RT. That's that you can get on the internet 24 hours a day, and then you'll find out what's really going on in the Ukraine. So they were in a similar situation over there. People had no confidence whatsoever in the government television, radio stations, or newspapers, so now they would turn to Radio Rebelde for regular reports, sometimes hourly battle reports coming back from what was actually going on there. Today, Radio Rebelde continues to broadcast 24 hours a day via 44 transmitters on an FM dial that covers 98% of the island of Cuba. There's also a shortwave signal on the 60-meter band, and there are several AM transmitters. I won't bother going through those frequencies. Anyhow, of course they have a lot of other radio and TV stations in Cuba too, but that one just continues, and it has that historical background. The Civic Resistance wing of the 26th of July movement wanted to try repeating the 1933 general strike tactic to bring down the dictatorship first. Now you remember the party had organized a general strike against Mikado, which had worked and brought down the administration and brought Batista to power, who was then a sergeant. They wanted to try it again, except that this time they weren't going to bring any sergeant to power, they were going to bring themselves to power. Now, so they had gotten that smart anyway. Now, one of the problems with organizing a civic resistance in 1958 was that Frank País had tried it the year before, and it had been suppressed, and everybody was dead. But they thought they might be able to do it again. So on the one hand, Fidel didn't think that that general strike was going to work, but he did think that he had to give them a chance to go ahead and try. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe they could upset things enough that it would work. On May 3rd, 1958, a strategy meeting was held at Altos de Montpellier, which is in the eastern part of the Sierra Madre, where all of the leaders of the provinces were called to be in attendance with the general staff. Why? Because when the uprising was attempted, it did fail. By this time, Batista's secret police, the Military Intelligence Service, SIM, had become well aware of the danger of this possibility, and they had brutally suppressed the civic uprising. So Fidel had given them a chance. They had done their best. They had failed. Now on May 3rd of 58, they were going to have a strategy meeting. And this time, Che Guevara gives the report from the Chiefs of Staff's office, and he says, the fundamental problem was the attitude of the Civic Resistance that had led them to think that the strategy of urban general strike was somehow superior to the armed struggle. Secondly, further, he said they had let wishful thinking influence their judgment as to the relative strength of the dictatorship in the cities vis-a-vis these rebel fighting squads that they were going to throw up. This could not have been a replay of the 1933 general strike against Mikado, because these relative strengths were far different then than they are now. In other words, the dictatorship is far stronger now than Mikado's was in 1933. Thirdly, and specifically, Che said David Salvador, their labor organizer, had let his innate anti-communism prevent him from allying with the Communist Party, the PSP. The Communist Party in Cuba at this time had the name Partido Socialista Popular because of electoral reasons that go back 20 years earlier in the 1940s. But that was only a difference in name. It was the Communist Party. And of course everybody knew that, and the labor organizer for these fellows in the cities was an anti-communist, and he didn't want an alliance with the Communist Party. So this had discouraged the participation of urban workers that were under Communist Party leadership. Fourthly, Che said that Rene Ramos was specifically responsible for overestimating the fighting potential of the Civic Resistance fighting squads. Finally, fifth, Faustino Perez had fucked up the timing of the general strike, canceling the original date and rescheduling it at a bad time. Those are his words, not mine. Well, they're mine now. Anyway, those attacked fought back and stood by their idea that the communists should not be allowed to become partners in the struggle against Batista. Fidel settled the matter in Che's favor and called the offenders to accept this document or resign. Then the final solution strategy was of expanding the armed struggle, and Fidel presented the strategy about how that was going to be implemented. All eligible to vote concurred, and that was the end of that matter. Now, to conclude the Civil War, as it turns out, what we're heading to, because by the very end, last day of this year, 58, Batista is going to flee the island. The whole thing's going to be over with. But they don't know that yet, of course, and Batista had sent his favorite butcher general, Eugenio Cantillo, with 37,000 men to fight against Fidel Castro's 200 rebel soldiers holding the base headquarters at Mount Turquino, where they've got this rebel radio, on May 25th of 58. So outnumbered 185 to 1, the government army should have had an easy walk of the thing, wouldn't you think? Instead, Fidel fought a stall and retreat action all through the month of June 58, aimed at bleeding the advancing columns to the point the soldiers who had joined for 3 hots at a cot would lose their taste for death. Now, I think I have mentioned several times that I had gotten involved at exactly this time in an attempt to join Fidel Castro's forces in Cuba, and in the first week of June of 58, shortly after my 16th birthday, I made an attempt to get there by hitchhiking from Boise, Idaho. This is well before we had interstate highways. At that time, my father, Graydon W. Smith, was the Republican Attorney General of the state of Idaho. So as soon as my parents found out what I'd done, because I'd left a letter behind, my dad had called the head of the state police, and he had said, "Great, don't worry, we'll have him before he's out of the state." I was already out of the state. By this time, I was just north of Salt Lake City, and I was heading south. I was going to cross over the Rockies, and that night I did get high in the Rockies, spent a night in an old truck. The next day I got picked up by some fishermen. They were heading back to Wichita, and on the radio, there was NBC had a show then called Monitor. On the radio they were giving my description and my route, which I didn't know how they'd gotten it yet. I was going to find out later that the FBI had kicked the door on another one of the students who was a member of our group and scared him to the point that he started crying and gave them the map and everything else that was on that he had of mine, and so they knew exactly where I was going and how I was planning on doing it. And that now Monitor was broadcasting this, and these guys looked at each other and they turned around and looked at me, and one of them said, "Jesus Christ, we got him right here." Well, they had said, "Look, we're not going to get involved in your business. You probably should go home, but what we'll do is just drop you off outside of Wichita and you can continue on your way and we'll forget we ever saw you." But before that could happen, we got stopped at a roadblock outside of Wichita. It turned out to be an FBI roadblock, and they were going through all the cars, and somebody looked in the back seat, saw me, grabbed me and pulled me out of there. And this FBI agent said,